The Revelation Explained by F.G. Smith. Chapter 16. Chapter 16 is very long and not easily divided, but I've done my best to divide it logically into 6 parts. We begin with the book of Revelation, chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. And I heard a great voice out of the temple, saying to the 7 angels, Go your ways, and pour out the vials of the wrath of God upon the earth. And the first went, and poured out his vial upon the earth, and there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image. We continue now with the commentary. A great voice out of the temple, now filled with the glory of the divine presence, commanded the 7 angels to enter upon their mission. It came therefore from God, who alone fixed the time for these judgments to begin. Before an intelligent explanation of these plagues can be given, however, the following points must be made clear. Number 1, where the vials were poured out. Number 2, upon whom they were emptied. Number 3, why they were thus poured out. And number 4, when they were fulfilled, or rather at what time they began to be fulfilled. These points we will first briefly consider in the order named, after which we will discuss the nature of the plagues and their individual application. Number 1. Where? The place where these vials of wrath were poured out was, quote, upon the earth, end quote. That is, the apocalyptic earth, or that portion of the earth made the special subject of the apocalyptic vision, namely, the territory of the 10 kingdoms. The last 2 vials, however, will be found to embrace a larger territory. Number 2, upon whom? They were poured out upon those, quote, which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image, end quote. It has already been shown that the image made by the 2nd beast of chapter 13 was the Protestant ecclesiastical organizations. Hence, the beast here referred to which the image was made, must signify the ecclesiastical hierarchy of Rome, the original. So the plagues fell upon the adherents of both organized Romanism and Protestantism in Europe. 3. Why? The reason why the judgments of the first 3 vials especially descended upon them was because, quote, they had shed the blood of saints and prophets, end quote, from verse 6. That Romanism was a fierce oppressor of God's people has already been noticed. Protestantism, as their persecutor, also must now be considered further. Protestant sects, after they first became established and got power in their own hands, acted much in the same manner as the Church of Rome did before them, persecuting, banishing, imprisoning, and even putting to death those who refused to receive their tenets or to conform to the system of religion they had adopted. The Lutherans, at first a pious, persecuted people, on becoming numerous and exalted by the favor of the great, established, a certain system of religion, and then, when it was in their power, persecuted, imprisoned, banished, or put to death all that dissented. As early after the Reformation as 1574, in a convention at Torgau, they established the real presence in the Eucharist and instigated the Elector of Saxony to seize, imprison, and banish all the secret Calvinists that differed from them in sentiment, and to reduce their followers by every act of violence, to renounce their sentiments, and to confess the ubiquity. Pucer, for his opinions, suffered 10 years of imprisonment in the severest manner. In 1577, a form of concord was produced in which the real manducation, or the real eating of Christ's body and blood in the Eucharist, was established, and heresy and excommunication laid on all that refused this as an article of faith, with pains and penalties to be enforced by the secular arm. Crelius, in 1601, was put to death. In Switzerland, before the city of Zurich was entirely safe itself from the encroachments of Romanism, its Protestant council condemned a young man named Felix Manz to be drowned because he insisted that the baby sprinkling of Romanism was not baptism, and that all who had received the rite ought to be immersed. This sentence was carried into effect. The severest laws were passed in different countries of Europe against the Anabaptists, and large numbers were banished or burnt at the stake. See Encyclopedia Britannica, article Anabaptists. Protestants may claim this was because of their fanaticism on other lines, but it remains a fact, nevertheless, that the chief sentiment at the base of these laws was religious persecution, and that Protestants sanctioned and carried them into execution. King Henry VIII, the founder of the established church in England, adopted the most stringent laws to enforce its doctrines. Certain articles of religion were drawn up, known in history as the Bloody Six Articles. Concerning these, the People's Cyclopedia says, quote, "The doctrines were substantially those of the Roman Catholic Church. Whoever denied the first articles, that embodying the doctrine of transubstantiation, was to be declared a heretic, and burnt without opportunity of abjuration. Whoso spoke against the other 5 articles should, for the first offense, forfeit his property, and whosoever refused to abjure his first offense, or committed a second, was to die like a felon." This comes from article Henry VIII. Another quote, "The royal reformer persecuted alike Catholics and Protestants. Thus, on one occasion, 3 Catholics who denied that the king was the rightful head of the church, and 3 Protestants who disputed the doctrine of the real presence in the sacrament, were dragged on the same sled to the place of execution." End quote. In speaking of that period of history and of the religious persecutions of the times, Myers says, quote, punishment of heresy was then regarded by both Catholics and Protestants alike as a duty which could be neglected by those in authority only at the peril of heaven's displeasure. Believing this, those of that age could consistently do nothing less than labor to exterminate heresy with axe, sword, and faggot. End quote from General History, page 553. That religious intolerance, even at a later date, was practiced in England, witnessed the 12 years' imprisonment of John Bunyan, and the hundreds confined in jails throughout that country for not conforming to the established religion. It was such severe persecution by that early Protestant sect that drove the Puritans from England's fair country to the then inhospitable shores of America, that they might have an opportunity to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. In Scotland, the Covenanters, quote, insisted on their right to worship God in their own way. They were therefore subjected to most cruel and unrelenting persecution. They were hunted by English troopers over their native moors and among the wild recesses of their mountains, whither they secretly retired for prayer and worship. The tales of the suffering of the Scotch Covenanters at the hands of the English Protestants form a most harrowing chapter of the records of the ages of religious persecution. End quote. This list might be considerably augmented, but it is unnecessary. However, that Protestant persecution and tyranny should never reach the enormous extent of the Romanists before them is proved by the fact that her horns were, quote, like a lamb, end quote, from chapter 13, verse 11. Number 4, when. It is very important for us to ascertain the time for the beginning of these plagues, for they cannot be identified unless we understand the chronology of the events described. It is a fact no one can question that the 7th plague is the judgment of the last day. For in the 7, quote, is filled up, end quote, the wrath of God. Hence, they are denominated the last plagues. It is also a fact well known to all who are spiritual and who understand the truth in the present Reformation that certain events said to occur under the period of the 6th plague are now taking place, namely the confederation of all false religions to oppose the people of God, led on by the unclean spirits that come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. From verses 13 and 14. Therefore, 5 of the plagues precede the time in which we are now reliving. It is evident that the plagues could not begin before the Reformation, for the vials were poured out upon the, quote, image of the beast, end quote, Protestantism. Hence we are directed to some period between the 16th century and the present day for their commencement. The reason why the first judgments especially were poured out will assist us in determining the starting point. Quote, they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, end quote. This expression seems to indicate that the time for the plagues to begin was after Romanism and Protestantism ceased putting people to death because of their religious sentiments. That this is the correct idea is clearly proved by what was said to the martyrs when they cried unto God for the avenging of their blood on them that dwell on the earth. Quote, "And it was said unto them that they should rest yet for a little season, until their fellow servants also and their brethren that should be killed as they were should be fulfilled." End quote from chapter 6, verses 10 and 11. For additional information concerning the terrible persecutions that followed the 16th century Reformation, see remarks on chapter 6, verse 10 and 11. We must now determine about what time the great persecutions referred to ceased, or nearly ceased, and that will give us the right starting point from which to reckon the pouring out of the first vial. In AD 1685, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes by Louis XIV of France took place, and in the terrible persecutions that occurred during his reign, 300,000 are said to have lost their lives. The time that we are endeavoring to establish then must be later than the 17th century. Louis died in 1714. Persecutions continued from time to time in France with considerable severity until about the middle of the century. Quote, "Soon after this, the flowing of heretic blood ceased, though an effort was made in 1765 by the popish clergy to resist the tendency to toleration by a remonstrance to the king." End quote. From History of Romanism, page 608. A few individual cases of persecution may have occurred later in other countries, but in the main, we are safe in pointing to about the middle of the 18th century for the general cessation of these religious murders. We will end with part 1 of chapter 16 here.